In 1969, a woman in her late 70s walked through a small house in Brooklyn with a tape recorder, narrating every room from memory. To the public, she was the Kennedy matriarch, rosary in hand, grief worn quietly. But she wasn't reminiscing. She was curating. This was the same woman who had once kept index cards tracking her children's weight and illness. A daughter she hadn't visited in 2 decades was living in an institution in Wisconsin. Another daughter was buried an ocean away without her. And the husband who had spent 40 years humiliating her could no longer form a sentence. To understand how she became this person, you have to go back to a wedding designed to be forgettable. A small wedding on purpose. On October 7, 1914, Rose Fitzgerald married Joseph Kennedy in a private chapel, with only about 75 guests. That's an odd choice, given who her father was. John "Honey" Fitzgerald had been one of Boston's most theatrical mayors, a man who sang in the streets and put his daughter's graduation on the front page. He could have filled a cathedral. He filled a chapel instead, for 2 reasons. He didn't want this marriage, and by that autumn, he was in no position to throw one. Rose herself had already been molded for a public role. Her mother avoided the spotlight, so from around age 16, Rose stood in for her, touring Europe with her father, meeting presidents, even sitting with him in a private audience with the Pope. She learned early that performing a family's public image was a job, and that whoever did it well quietly gained power nobody else noticed. There's a story she told about herself for the rest of her life. As a child at the White House, President McKinley told her sister she was the prettiest girl he'd ever seen. Rose's own takeaway, decades later, wasn't hurt or envy. It was strategy. She decided, at 6 or 7, that she'd simply have to work harder on herself. Then came a decision she resented into her 90s. She'd been accepted to Wellesley. Instead, her father sent her to a strict Catholic convent school, and later to a convent academy in the Netherlands, because a Catholic Boston mayor couldn't be seen with a daughter at a Protestant college. She was a political asset before she was anything else, and assets don't pick their own schools. Here's what makes that detail matter. Decades later, when historian Doris Kearns Goodwin asked Rose about her greatest regret, she expected an answer about her murdered sons. Rose said, Wellesley. 3 of her children died violently. 1 was destroyed by a surgery her husband ordered without her knowledge. And the wound she named out loud was the school she never got to attend. Call it cold if you want. It's also the most honest thing she ever said. That what she never recovered from was learning her own wishes didn't count. What each of them was buying. Meanwhile, her father was unraveling. In 1913, a scandal involving a young woman nicknamed Toodles forced Honey Fitz out of the 1914 mayoral race. The official story was health problems. The real story, his family said nothing, waited it out, and the scandal quietly died. Rose, 23 at the time, watched an Irish Catholic family survive a sex scandal purely through silence. She'd use that lesson for the rest of her life. She'd known Joe Kennedy since childhood summers in Maine. Her father thought he wasn't good enough. In Boston Irish terms, the Fitzgeralds held office. The Kennedys were just merchants. The courtship dragged on for 7 years against her father's disapproval, until Joe became, at 25, the youngest bank president in the country. A title, not a character reference, but it was enough. What were they each actually getting? Joe got the mayor's daughter, the most socially valuable Catholic woman in Boston, trained since adolescence to work a room. Rose got out of a house where her father made every decision for her, and she got a husband who was clearly about to become very rich. She wasn't naive about any of it. She'd watched her own mother absorb humiliation in silence. She married anyway, and then did something telling. She wrote it all down. In the Kennedy Library archives, there's a document she titled, at 24, The Wedding Log, her own honeymoon recorded by her. She would keep records like this for the rest of her life, eventually filling roughly 250 boxes. Nobody accumulates that much paper on accident. That's someone building a case file on her own existence. 9 children, run like a department. They started in a modest house on Beale Street in Brooklyn. 9 children arrived over 18 years. Joe Jr., Jack, Rosemary, Kathleen, Eunice, Patricia, Robert, Jean, and Edward. Rose ran the household like an operation. A card for every child, tracking illness, weight, dental visits. A habit her adult daughters were still feeling decades later when notes about their weight kept showing up in the mail. Some of it was pure logistics. 9 kids is a management problem. But listen to how she described her own role in that 1969 house tour. New mothers were confined for 3 weeks after birth back then. So christenings were small, and she made sure each child was baptized quickly, meaning she was never actually present for any of her children's baptisms. She says it like a scheduling detail. Every baptism in a family built entirely around Catholic identity. And she missed every one. If you're looking for where the coldness started, that's it. Not something invented later by bitter sons, but baked into the arrangement from day one. The rule always outranked the feeling, because she'd learned as a girl that rules don't bend and feelings do. Joe, meanwhile, was rarely home, making money first in Boston, then New York, then Hollywood at a startling pace. He started at $10,000 a year. Within a decade, he was a multimillionaire, moving the family to New York essentially because he'd given up trying to break into Boston's Protestant elite. Rose had no house of her own, no independent income, no career, and, as a devout Catholic married by a cardinal, no real path to divorce. And her husband was in California, running a film studio alongside a woman more famous than her own father ever was. 3 weeks at her father's house. Around 1920, pregnant again with a 4th child on the way, Rose left Joe and went home to her father. She stayed about 3 weeks. What happened at the end of those 3 weeks shaped the next 50 years. Honey fits didn't comfort her. He told her, in effect, that she was a Catholic wife with a Catholic marriage, and she'd go back and make it work. This from the man whose own marriage had survived a public scandal purely through silence. He wasn't giving her a moral lesson. He was handing her the family playbook. So she stopped trying to leave and started managing instead. She built a life running parallel to her marriage rather than inside it. Daily mass, a schedule she controlled, and constant travel, often timed, as one Kennedy Library researcher has noted, for exactly when Joe would otherwise be home alone with the kids. It wasn't surrender. It was the one lever she had, and she used it. Joe, for his part, wasn't subtle. In 1927, he began an affair with movie star Gloria Swanson that lasted roughly 3 years. A relationship that also devastated her career after his business advice went badly wrong. In 1929, he brought Swanson along on the same transatlantic crossing as his wife. There are photographs of the 3 of them together. For decades afterward, Rose referred to Swanson publicly as a friend who'd had some trouble. Swanson herself, writing much later in a memoir that should be read with some skepticism, wondered whether Rose was a fool, a saint, or simply the better actress. The truth is probably the third option nobody wanted to sit with. A woman who'd decided, since age 16, that managing the family's public face was her actual job, and she was the only one qualified to do it. London, and the fall. For a brief stretch, the arrangement looked like it had turned into something real. In 1938, FDR appointed Joe ambassador to Britain, and Rose, trained her whole life for exactly this, thrived. She was presented at court, landed on best-dressed lists, charmed the British press. For about 18 months, the Kennedys were America's success story abroad, and for once Rose wasn't competing with anyone for the spotlight. It ended because Joe torched it himself, publicly arguing British democracy was finished and resigning in disgrace by late 1940. His political ambitions were over within weeks, by his own mouth. The effect on the marriage wasn't liberation. It just shifted all the family's ambition onto the sons and made the public performance even more essential. Joe couldn't be the candidate anymore, so he became the operation behind the candidates, and Rose became its most convincing product: the devoted Catholic mother, the mayor's daughter, the ambassador's wife. The daughter who didn't fit, Rosemary, born in 1918, developed more slowly than her siblings and never caught up, sociable and well-liked. But inside a family obsessed with winning, an ongoing complication. She did well at a convent school in England before the war. But back in the US in her early 20s, she grew increasingly agitated and began slipping out at night. In November 1941, without telling his wife, Joseph Kennedy authorized a prefrontal lobotomy. It went catastrophically wrong. Rosemary, 23, lost most of her speech and her ability to walk unassisted and needed care for the rest of her life. Rose found out afterward. That's arguably the single worst thing Joe ever did. What Rose did next is arguably the worst thing she did. She enforced total silence around it. Rosemary was moved to an institution in Wisconsin. Her father never saw her again. Rose didn't see her for roughly 20 years. The younger children weren't told where their sister actually was. The public got vague stories about her being reclusive. It worked. For almost 3 decades. Because Rose had learned exactly this lesson, watching her own father survive Toodles. You don't discuss it, and the family moves on. Kick in 1944, Rose's daughter Kathleen, Kick, announced she wanted to marry a Protestant British aristocrat, William Cavendish, heir to the Duke of Devonshire. Rose fought it with everything she had: letters, clergy, pressure through relatives. When Kick married him anyway in a small civil ceremony in London, exactly one Kennedy attended. Her brother Joe Jr. Rose refused to go and barred the rest of the family from attending. Consider the contrast. This is the same woman who'd been publicly humiliated when her husband put his mistress on her own ocean liner, and who responded by protecting him, now deploying the family's full weight against her own 24-year-old daughter for marrying someone she loved. The system that trapped Rose didn't make her gentle. It made her fluent in its rules. Within weeks, Kick's husband was killed in combat, and so was her brother Joe Jr. 4 years later, Kick fell in love again, this time with a married Irish peer. Rose reportedly gave an ultimatum: end it or be cut off. Kick was flying to meet her father to plead her case when the plane crashed in a storm. She was 28. Her father was the only family member at her funeral. Rose didn't attend the wedding, she didn't attend the burial. She left her daughter in England, buried among strangers by marriage. The long silence breaks. The next 15 years were the family's ascent. The Senate, the presidency, the most photographed young family on earth, with Rose campaigning tirelessly and helping deliver the women's vote that helped elect her son. Then in December 1961, Joseph Kennedy had a massive stroke. He survived 8 more years, largely unable to speak or walk. The man who'd once controlled every decision, every dollar, every headline, now entirely dependent on the household his wife ran. He could hear what was said about him. He could no longer argue back. Rose was 71. She had 34 years left. Around 1961, she started visiting Rosemary again. After Joe died in 1969, the younger children finally learned the truth about where their sister had been all along, and began visiting her too. Rose also became the public face of the family's work on intellectual disabilities, an effort her daughter Eunice turned into the Special Olympics. The same family that had hidden Rosemary away built a global institution in her name, with Rose standing at the front of it. Both things are true at once. In the late 1960s, Rose bought back the house on Beale Street, the same narrow house where 4 of her children were born, where she'd once kept those index cards as a young banker's wife with no money of her own. She furnished it from memory and donated it as a historic site, then personally recorded the audio tour, her voice in every room describing exact times, beds, christening gowns, favorite books. In 1974, she published a memoir, warm and carefully controlled, with nearly every person who could have contradicted it already dead, silenced, or institutionalized. The Archive. After she died in 1995 at 104, her family donated her personal papers to the Kennedy Library. Roughly 250 boxes, diaries, scrapbooks, the 1914 wedding log, records of ocean crossings, drafts of speeches. One researcher who spent years going through it all put it simply: Rose seemed to throw away nothing that ever passed through her hands. And yet readers who went in expecting revelations mostly found what she'd already chosen to tell the world. That was the point. You don't control your own story by destroying the record. Destroyed records only announce that something's missing. You control it by producing so much material, so early and so consistently, that your version simply becomes the official one. She started that project on her honeymoon at 24. She was still doing it in her 90s. What the marriage actually was, it wasn't a love story. And it wasn't quite a hostage situation either. It was closer to a family corporation with 2 founders who stopped sharing a life around 1920, but never stopped sharing an interest. He supplied money and ambition. She supplied legitimacy, Catholic respectability, and a public face immune to scandal. Neither one could afford to walk away. Whether real affection survived underneath any of it, the records don't say, because she made absolutely sure they wouldn't. The people who paid for that arrangement were the daughters, Rosemary, silenced and institutionalized, Kick, punished for choosing love over doctrine. That's the part the polished myth was built to hide. A woman denied her own choice of college by her father, ordered back into her marriage by that same father, then handed a devastated daughter by her husband. Didn't come out of it gentle. She came out of it as the enforcer of the very rules that had once been used against her. Picture her again in that Brooklyn bedroom in 1969, describing exactly which bed, which afternoon, which hour her son the president was born. Every word of it true, and also the absolute limit of what she was ever willing to say about that room, that marriage, that family. A fact stated with such precision, it leaves no room to ask a second question. She wasn't a saint, and she wasn't a fool. Gloria Swanson guessed the real answer decades ago and never quite realized how right she was. Rose Kennedy was simply the better actress, and she's still delivering that performance in her own voice, inside a house she bought back so she could finish furnishing the memory herself.